The 1980s brought comics to the forefront. Watchmen, Dark Knight, Marvel Secret Wars. Comics were super profitable. People were buying them up, lining up, and publishers were seeing profits that made the shareholders happy. Around sometime in 1993, a #1 issue of Batman sold for $55,000. And so collectors started flocking to comic book stores in order to buy up every issue of every comic in hopes of finding the next cash cow that will pay for their retirement. Around this time, publishers realized that most of the money was coming from collectors, and so they pivoted the business around that. Limited run variant covers started to become more prevalent, but also they started pushing out stories of important events that changed the canon of the comic universe. Stories like Death of Superman and new characters were being introduced, as well as new publishers entering the game. And the collectors came out in droves, buying up every copy of the first appearance of X or the time that Y happens. Eventually, the market was flooded with these kind of stories, and then the bubble popped. Suddenly, the future of comics industry was up in the air. One of the worst impacted was Marvel, who had already sold those Spider-Man movie rights back in 1985, and they ended up back with them, and then they sold the movie rights to Sony for $7 million in order to try and keep the company afloat. I don't think it's a hot take to say that the Spider-Verse movies are good. Like, we got to see characters from the first movie grow and develop. Hobie Brown is my favorite character by a country mile. I hate the AM, I hate the PM, meaning that he hates mornings and he hates the prime minister. It's such a fun, clever line that dances between a fire bar and a quote from I'm 14 and This Is Deep. We got to see Rio be a more active character in Miles' life, which is great because this Rio is such a different character from the comics, and I'm really glad that they're fully developing her. And finally, the crux of this video, Miguel O'Hara, who is Irish from his father and Mexican from his mother. Which, like, if I had a nickel for every fair-skinned Mexican-Irish superhero that was super prolific in the 90s, I would have 2 nickels. The other one being Kyle Rayner, Green Lantern from DC. Yeah, this guy, he's Mexican. Who probably became best known for being the Green Lantern who had his girlfriend killed and shoved into a fridge for his own character development, which is where we get the term fridging from. Which feels like a very monkey's paw side effect for representation, but that's a video for another day. In this one, we're going to talk about Miguel's role in the story, not only in relation to Miles, but also in relation to Peter Parker. Now, there's still some details that are left out because there's still, a whole third movie to come out, but basically Miguel has tried to change his fate as Spider-Man and it backfired. When we meet Miguel in the post-credits scene of Into the Spider-Verse, he is bantering with Lila, and it's pretty fun. He has built a gizmo that allows him to hop into alternate dimensions, and he goes to where it all began, and ends up doing the Spider-Man pointing meme with the Spider-Man cartoon from the 1960s. Presumably, the Collider events from the first movie happened, and that left cracks in the multiverse that allowed apparently only Spider-Man villains to leave their dimensions and go and cause chaos in other universes. These escapees are called anomalies, and it's up to Miguel and his strike squad to gather around and collect them and throw them in the go-home machine, which actually is a pretty cool name. Miguel has gathered all of these people that he deems worthy with special lieutenants like Jessica Drew and Ben Reilly in order to fight these baddies and restore the quote-unquote canon, aka the way things are supposed to be. Along the way, Jess picks up Gwen to be her protege. Which seems like a noble cause, These things are not supposed to happen. Outside events place them into these situations and they cause a danger to themselves and others because being in the quote-unquote wrong dimension will cause you to glitch out and lead to a painful death. But also, they are a danger to others. Since the Spider-Person of that dimension might not be equipped to handle a villain from another dimension, the squad will go in, clean up, and send the bad guy back to their proper dimension. That's not the only thing the Spider Squad does. While in Moonbaton, Gwen gets a notification from Lila that a canon event is about to happen. Miles sees that something bad is about to go down, and he goes to prevent it. Gwen tries to stop him, but ultimately lets him go. Turns out what Miles interfered with is a canon event, and by interfering with it, he risks the integrity of the universe, and a giant black hole appears. The Spider Squad appears to quote-unquote fix it, and then Jess takes the kids and Hobie back to Spider-Man HQ, where everyone talks about the great and mysterious Miguel. We see Miguel brooding over computer screens, staring at himself on a computer screen, monologuing about how he doesn't like what he has to do, but he has to do it, before injecting himself with spider serum. Miles brings Miguel an empanada, greets him in Spanish, to which Miguel reacts by throwing a desk at him. Miguel then presents a network, a spider web, which he explains is the Spider-Verse, and where all the nodes converge is what's called a canon event. Events that are a part of every spider story every time. Event ASM 90, which is short for Amazing Spider-Man issue number 90, which I thought was pretty cute, is one where a police captain close to Spider-Man dies while saving a child. We see various Spider people, like Josh Keaton's Spectacular Spider-Man, live-action Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, and our very own Peter B., all holding Captain Stacy. Miles looks at Hobie and Jess, and they both look at him confirming that yes, this is supposed to happen. The guy that Miles saved was the police captain for Paviter, the Indian Spider-Man of Boombatan Dimension, which means that Miles disrupted the event that was supposed to make Paviter a full-fledged Spider-Man in the eyes of Miguel. Miles interrupting this could cause the world to unravel, and they're working to save it. Miles asks him how he knows. Why is he so sure that you can't change the story? Miguel then explains to him that he once tried to change his fate. He found a version of himself that was happy and that had a daughter, but that version died, so he swooped in to replace him. And Miguel was happy. He felt joy, but then he messed with too many events, and he butterfly affected too close to the sun, and that dimension and all of his people glitched away, including his daughter, who disappeared in his arms. Peter B was also there to confirm that yes, that's what happened, the way he described it. Miguel then explains if too many people try to break too many canon events, then the whole Spider-Verse can collapse, implying that every dimension that has a Spider-Person could be in danger. Miles realizes that his dad is about to be captain, and that in 2 days, according to the algorithm, he will die trying to save a child on the day that he was sworn in. Miguel says the words, "We all want to live the life we wish we had. Believe me, I tried." All of the Spider Society starts to form around him, and a voice calls out. Miles turns and sees Penny from Into the Spider-Verse disarm her mech and look at him solemnly. Which I'm taking a pause to say, people on Twitter said that she got the Evangelion treatment, and it still makes me laugh all these weeks later. Penny, get in a robot while I play with a clone of your dead dad. Miles tells Miguel that he can't make him not try to save his dad, and Miguel says that he knows and traps him. Peter B tries to reason with Miguel, but Hobie tells Miles how to break out of the trap. Miles breaks the trap and a chase ensues. At some point, Peter B and Miles are having a moment together, and Peter B tells Miles that bad things are going to happen. He tells him that all of the bad things led to him meeting Miles, and that led to Mayday being born. The chase continues on a train that seems to be going to the moon. Miguel tells Miles that he is the original anomaly. Miles is from Earth 1610, and the spider that bit him and gave him his powers came from Earth 42. From the first movie is just a fun Jackie Robinson Brooklyn Dodgers reference, and then the fact that they built it into the plot here and made it actually important is really cool. Miguel tells Miles that he doesn't deserve to be here and that he doesn't deserve his power. Gwen tells him that they're protecting him for his own good. Miles says, "Who decides that?" Miguel says he's just a kid who doesn't know what he's doing. Miles then reveals that his plan was to lure all of the Spider Society away from HQ, and he uses this opportunity to get back into the Go Home machine. But the machine reads the spider DNA and sends him back to Earth 42 instead of 1610. Miles sees his Uncle Air again, and as happy as he is to see him, he knows something is wrong. He goes to the roof to see a graffiti memorial for his dad, Jeff Morales. Miles gets knocked out by Figure, and as soon as he wakes up, he expects to see Aaron as the Prowler, but instead he sees a different person wearing Prowler gear. When he asks who he is, he takes off the mask and in perfect Spanish says, "I'm Miles Morales." Roll credits, and we're left with a to be continued in Beyond the Spider-Verse. Alright, enough of the recap. Let's get into the meat of what all of that means. One of the things I love about this movie is how the cast of voice actors tends to match the lived experiences that the characters that they're playing have lived, which is very rare for animated projects. I don't know Jake Johnson's relationship with the culture, but he has a Jewish father and he voices Peter B, the only Spider-Man confirmed to be Jewish. I bring this up because the attitude that Peter B has is one that says to Miles that good things can come from bad. And while I'm not equipped or learned enough to talk about in detail, I know that a lot of Jewish culture celebrations, Passover, Hanukkah, Yom Kippur, all these are beautiful holidays and celebrations that bring joy, but also honor and recognize the bad things that have happened that led to these things happening. The Miles we know and follow is voiced by Shamik Moore, who doesn't speak Spanish that well, but that makes sense because he's Jamaican, which you get a little homage to when he gets the beef patty from the bodega in the beginning of the movie when he meets the bad guy. But when we go to Earth 42, we meet the Miles of that world. He is voiced by Jarrell Jerome, an Afro-Latino Dominican, which makes sense because in this universe, Miles' dad died, and so he was raised by his mom and thus has a closer connection to his Latinidad. This is also referenced in the Miles Morales video game, where in the first Christmas after his dad died, Miles is seen celebrating Nochebuena with his mom. And then we get to Penny, who's the only Spider-Person from the first movie we see, and I think it's for a good reason. Penny is the only East Asian character we see, and she looks different than she did in the first movie, which I think speaks to the model minority myth. The idea of the model minority came from propaganda during the Cold War, which meant that by allowing educated Asian people in who could bolster the economy, the US could hold them up as a goal to aspire to in terms of assimilation and success. The truth is that the Asian community has suffered from systemic racism as well. It can be assumed that Penny tried to go against the status quo and suffered for it, and now she is helping Miguel because she sees it as inevitable or the only choice. Which brings us to the man of the hour, Miguel O'Hara. Miguel is voiced by Oscar Isaac, who is a very good actor. He is one of those actors that I will watch anything that he's in. A mainstream audience might know him from the Star Wars sequels, but he's in a category of actors like auteur. Like, he's in it for the love of the craft. I don't think he's doing things for the money. Arguably, the first thing that got him on people's radar is A Most Violent Year with Jessica Chastain, or for me, it was Ex Machina with the girl from Tomb Raider. I meant to look up her name, but I'm reading the script now and I'm realizing that I forgot to do it. Both of those came out in 2014 when he was 35 years old. Oscar's full government name is
Oscar Isaac Hernandez Estrada, because my mom's name, my last name is Estrada. Oscar Isaac Hernandez Estrada.
Anybody who looks at Oscar would probably be able to guess that he's Latino. At the very least, if you have to be told it, it wouldn't be as big a surprise as finding out that the actor who played Sean Spencer from Psych is Mexican. He was James Roday at the time, his government name, James Rodriguez. He made that his screen actor's name because he could not get a single role because he could not get a job with a Hispanic last name, despite him very much presenting as white. Although recently he's begun to reclaim his heritage, his screen actor name is now James Roday Rodriguez, and he's even getting Hispanic last names in the roles he plays, like Gary Mendez from A Million Little Things, which I haven't seen, but good for him. Back to Oscar, I have no doubt that if he tried to keep his given last names, it would have taken a mainstream audience even longer to find him. Isaac is a pretty ambiguous name, and once he gets through the door, he can charm them. But given his complexion and his features, on a spectrum of representation, he can navigate through non-Latino white spaces without as big of a problem as other actors. He isn't like George Lopez or even Tenoch Huerta, where their ethnicity is very pronounced. And I'm not saying this to discount his Latinidad in any way. I am happy to see a Latino succeed. Representation is bad, if to put it lightly. 19% of the US population is Latino, but only 6% are leads in broadcast TV, 2% in cable, and only 7% are movie leads in streaming, and 3% in theaters. To put it into context, like, I want to say 400, 500 movies came out last year, so only 7% had a Latino lead, despite making up 1/5 of the population. As a Spider-Man, I have more in common with him than anybody who will ever play Peter Parker. Oscar has all of the right things going for him in order to break the glass ceiling, but will he be able to is yet to be seen because he's still pretty early in his career, and history is not in his favor. And even if he does, will he bring others up with him, or will he close the door behind him? This parallels very well with the character Miguel, not just from the movie, but also his comic book character and how he was perceived in the 90s, back when he was the other Spider-Man. Miguel O'Hara, aka Spider-Man 2099, was created by writer Peter David and artist Rick Leonardi in the 1990s, along with others during a 2099 run, which was a reimagining of characters 100 years in the future with a futuristic cyberpunk vibe to it all, which was very popular in the 90s. Other characters also written by David were Punisher and Doom, and eventually other writers joined and expanded out to the most mainstream ones at the time, like X-Men and Hulk. While sales were good in the beginning, eventually, like all comics during the 90s, sales began to plummet after the bubble burst. And I think it's important to emphasize that there was valid concern and speculation about the future of the comics industry. Suddenly, the number one issues weren't worth the paper they were printed on, and all the 2099 series were ended. He would continue to make cameos and appearances in the comics, but most people my age, 29, 30, would probably know him best from the Shattered Dimension video game and Edge of Time, the unofficial sequel. The game also explored interdimensional time-traveling villains and changing the future.
Oh no, what's wrong? It's Mary Jane. She dies. Tonight, right there at Alchemax.
How do you know? For shock's sake, Parker, what part of don't poke around in the archives was unclear?
Fine, I'm a nosy Parker, but now that I've found out,
It's what? My job to save her? I've got enough to deal with.
you can't mean that. You can't just ignore that she's in danger.
Hey, I'm trying to focus on what's important.
What's important is not standing by and allowing someone to suffer or die because you do nothing. If you don't get that, then you don't get the first thing about being Spider-Man.
You're the one who doesn't get it, Parker. The future depends on
My future is meaningless without her.
This is gonna be a huge mistake.
I owe you, Miguel. Big time.
Shocking right you do.
It was fine. I think I've played at a friend's house. I didn't really think much of it until I was making this video. Shattered Dimensions has a 74 on Metacritic, which to me is pick it up on Black Friday good, which is probably what I did if I'm being honest. But now anybody on the internet knows who Miguel O'Hara is, whether they want to or not. There are fan cams, there's fan art, merch everywhere. The internet is a completely different place now. You'd be hard pressed to find good AMVs or fan art of Miguel in the 2000s the way you do now. One of the reasons I think that he was successful in his time was that he basically came in with his own thing. The 2099 series was its own thing, like its own future and timeline, and it didn't try to disrupt any of the status quo. Nobody was really expecting Miguel to try and overthrow Peter, and nobody who wrote or drew for Miguel really wanted or tried to. But despite this claim, despite being the other Spider-Man, because let's be real, to this day, people don't rock with the 90s Ben Reilly, the run was still canceled, and it was because of forces outside of his control. It's a metaphor for capitalism. Compare that to Miles Morales, who was created in 2011 by Brian Michael Bendis and artist Sarah Pachili, and came in at a time where comics were having a rejuvenation. Also, fun fact, Bendis co-created Riri Williams. When Miles made his debut, Phase 1 of the MCU had just dropped. Captain America the First Avenger and Thor had come out, setting up all of the dominoes in place for the first Avengers movie in the following summer of 2012. I was 18 at the time of the first Avengers movie came out, and let me tell you, the attitude was electric. People were starting to get into comics, new lines were coming out, Matt Fraction's Hawkeye was about to start. It was a good time to be a comic book nerd. Sarah Zed has a very good video about the rise and fall of geek cultures in the 2010s. I'm going to put it in the description, but it's one of my favorite videos, and I encourage you to check it out to really get a feel for how predominant geek culture was during the time, especially during the early 2010s, if you don't believe me. To put something into context about how things were, I remember an English class I had, and my teacher, instructor, whatever, dedicated an entire section about how Joss Whedon was a feminist icon to give you an idea of how different the 2010s were. Now, of course, that's not without its initial backlash. Funny enough, he was created because when they were rebooting Spider-Man for the Amazing Spider-Man series, Donald Glover, hot off Community, had some people wanting him to be the next Peter Parker.
What happened was there was they were talking about on this geek blog about, you know, making Spider-Man, you know, they're redoing it. And maybe, you know, Spider-Man, maybe he doesn't have to be white. Maybe he can be black or Hispanic or something like that. And then somebody put a big picture of me in the comments. It was like, Donald Glover can play Spider-Man. He's nerdy. So I was like, oh, yeah, I'll put that up. So I put it up on my Twitter, and I was like, oh, Donald for Spider-Man, let's do this. You know, kind of joke, but also like, who doesn't want to be Spider-Man? That'd be cool. And half the world was like, Donald for Spider-Man. We're only going to watch the next Spider-Man if Donald Glover's playing Peter Parker. And the other half was like, he's black, kill him. Like, it was so fast.
And sure enough, a few years later, we got a Spider-Man who was black and Latino. Fast forward to today, and if you ask most children if they like Spider-Man, they'll ask which one. Miles has had a success, I would argue, on par with Wally West in terms of taking a legacy character's title and making it your own and finding your own crowd. Wally West was so successful that they changed Barry Allen's character to be more like him, and Miles has been successful enough that they changed a lot of Tom Holland's Peter Parker to be more like Miles. And yeah, of course, you're going to have your naysayers and nostalgia people who are going to be like, that's not my Spider-Man. That will never be my Spider-Man. And before you get in a comment, not all of it is racism. There are some very valid criticism about the initial run of comics that Miles had. Aaron was nowhere near as cool or well written as he was in the movies. Bendis said that he named Miles his dad after a childhood friend who just happened to be Jefferson Davis, the only president of the Confederacy, and he gave that name to a black man. Come on. The second movie low-key corrects this by making Jeff's last name Morales, which in the comics, Miles goes by his mom's last name because his dad was a SHIELD agent who didn't like superheroes. The movie versions of these characters arguably are the definitive version of these characters that a mainstream audience knows. They just kind of gloss over that. Speaking of Latino last names, let's talk about the Spider Society and the culture that Miguel has established. Miguel reached the ceiling on what he is quote-unquote allowed to do. He wanted to experience joy and happiness while also being Spider-Man, but doing so came at the cost of other people's lives, so we're told. And so he has determined that nobody can attempt to do what he did, because if he could not do it, then how could anybody else? The society that Miguel has formed is one in which he and his algorithm dictate what will and won't happen. Any deviation from this quote-unquote canon is demonized and hunted down. Any attempt to change this will be met with being hunted. The scene that made it all come together for me is a scene that most people understandably took as a surface level joke, but I personally think is the glue that holds this whole video together. The scene where Spider-Man is talking to a therapist Spider-Man, pouring his heart out, talking about his emotions, and the therapist unenthusiastically says, "And let me guess, your uncle died." And out of context, it seems like a funny Robot Chicken joke. But when you watch it in the context of the society that Miguel has created, it really paints a picture of the culture. It's a big joke among immigrant kids, especially within Latino culture, about how our parents loved to guilt trip us about how bad things were for them and how they sacrificed to give us a better life. So how dare we complain about our own problems? In fact, if you want to boil it down to the most simple bare bones, Abuela Femencanto and Miguel are basically the same character. They suffered a tragedy, and that leads to them being cruel and mean to a young idealistic kid because that kid threatens to disrupt the status quo, and they believe they're doing the right thing in order to maintain the life that they've built and not let another bad thing happen. Miguel has fostered an environment that not only expects but also welcomes suffering, but invalidates any feelings you have and makes you feel guilty for wanting to stop or change those feelings. While we're on the subject of Latinidad, let's talk about Miles and how Miguel perceives him. I spoke about anti-blackness in the Latina community in my America Chavez video, but there are some particular microaggressions present here. Now, the first and obvious thing is Miles tries to bring him food, an empanada, and greets him in Spanish and tries to broker peace. At this point in the story, Miles still wants to join the Spider Squad so that he can get the interdimensional watch so he can visit Gwen and Peter B whenever he wants. Miguel tosses it aside and throws a desk at him. And I don't think you need to know Latina culture to understand that the dismissal of peace offering, especially with food, is often considered a dick move. But it's the fact that Miguel takes the food and under his breath responds, "Que maravilla," which means how wonderful, and then proceeds to respond to him in English. And again, it'd be one thing if he preferred to speak English, but when Mayday appears and Miguel is having a migraine, he says, "No puedo más, no puedo más, no puedo más," which means I can't anymore, I can't anymore, I can't anymore. Like, he clearly knows and prefers Spanish, but he refuses to speak it to Miles. So when I was younger, yo tenía un acento muy mexicano y que era muy fuerte, pero these days my Spanish leans more towards functional than it does fluent. And that's fine with me. Speaking Spanish has never really affected my identity with my Latinidad, nor has it really affected anybody perceiving me as such. If you look online, you'll see lots of discourse, quote unquote, about whether or not you have to speak Spanish to be Latine. The whole no sabo joke that's super gatekeepy and stupid, but for the most part, that really flourishes online, but it's nowhere near as commonplace in real life. I've been to countless fiestas, quinces, bautismos, and there are people in the community together that some don't speak any Spanish, some don't speak any English, and yet they still greet each other and drink and break bread, and they got each other's back. But man, let me tell you, when it does happen, it pisses me off. Few things make me as angry as when I approach somebody who I know speaks Spanish and I'll talk to them in Spanish and then they respond to me in English. It's like the verbal equivalent of going to give somebody dap, but then they go for the handshake. Miles has had a different lived experience than somebody like me who has darker skin but doesn't present as black or white. But Miles still knows the music. He lives in the community. He knows the place to get cake is at the panaderia. And I have zero doubt that the cake he bought is tres leches. I eventually want to do a video on whether or not Miles is good Latino representation, because the short answer is yes, but the long, harder answer is also yes, but with nuance. So subscribe for that, hopefully dropping this year. But even then, any argument that he isn't Latino is stupid because his mom is Puerto Rican. Like, it's literally in his DNA. Just like any argument that he isn't Spider-Man is stupid because he literally has it in his DNA. Like, I can understand the pedantic argument that Miles has the day-to-day interactions of somebody who is black if he lived outside of New York, but within New York, nobody is surprised that he is Latino. Like, any argument against this just tells me you've never met Dominicans or Puerto Ricans. But that requires a further analysis that I'm not qualified to give right now. But there is one last thing I want to say. When Miguel is showing Miles the Spider-Verse, the only live-action Spider-Man we see is the Amazing Spider-Man played by Andrew Garfield. And while I can't defend the second movie as much, the arc of Garfield Spider-Man is an interesting one that a lot of people weren't ready for at the time. Well, a lot of the comics, Tobey Maguire's and Tom Holland's Spider-Mans are about sacrifice and how you have to give up the Peter Parker aspect of your life in order to be Spider-Man. Garfield attempts to have both. He says, "No, I am more than just a guy with web shooters. I am a whole person with wants and desires, and I have more to give to people than just what I can do behind a mask." And the parts of the second movie that I can defend are those parts. The parts where he tries to balance both things, but they have consequences. He struggles with the idea of, maybe I can't have it all. Maybe all I am to people is the mask. Garfield is the original guy who tries to fight fate, and not only got punished for it narratively, but also bashed as a character by a lot of the general public. There's this idea that in order to be Spider-Man, you have to be this and that, and you can't ride a skateboard. Miguel was being really close to being that guy in the 90s. He did all of the right things. He walked on eggshells around the legacy of Peter Parker, but ultimately still failed at it. Miguel has come to the conclusion that if I have to suffer, then everyone does. But Miles is the one that still has that optimism, that little boy that has people that love and support him. We see that Miguel still has the aspects of that old personality in there. And Peter B does too, which is why he tries to reason with him and remind him of that by giving Miguel Mayday to hold. And so it'll be interesting to see Miguel develop further from the last movie. If this analysis seems incomplete, it's because it is. There's still a whole third movie to come out, and there's lots of unanswered questions, like what's the deal with Miguel and the whole vampire thing? Lila and the algorithm say that some things have to happen, but she is loaded with things that Miguel tells her, so how much can she really be trusted? We have to wait a while to see if Miguel is going to have a redemption arc or if there's some underlying villainy kind of thing going on. I personally like to see my two favorite Latino Spider-Mans team up together and fight some bigger, battered thing going on. The metaphor for capitalism. We know that Peter B saw the world collapse, but is there anything Miguel is not telling him? I would love to see Miguel reminded of this from the Edge of Time video game.
I just want to say thank you. You're as brave and unselfish as another guy who goes by the handle Spider-Man. You're a worthy successor to the name.
Thanks. I mean that.
This movie was great. The first movie was amazing. I love this series so much and these characters. This has a potential to be my favorite trilogy of all time, so I'm really excited to get into it more. Tune in next time on Beyond the Spider-Verse, and I'll see you on the next video on this channel.